I have to remember what Donna said because now I've got verses I need to check off not to use in recruiting Sunday school teachers, because that's a really good point. This morning we are finishing up the 10 Commandments. We spent quite a bit of time this summer going through them, sometimes by themselves, sometimes in larger groups, and we are finishing in style this morning. We've got all of the coveting that you can handle and some of it that you wish you could. And so we've got it all there ready to go. And so as we're looking, this is the commandment that says, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's donkey, house, wife, etc." It's got this long list of stuff in there. And so I thought I should probably put a disclaimer at the start of this that says, in my life, I have never, ever, 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 ever coveted my neighbor's donkey. There's a follow-up question to that, which is, well, why not? I've never had a neighbor that's had a donkey. So it makes it really hard to do that. But as we get into this commandment, so we're finishing up, it's the very last one. I thought it'd be a good idea to kind of go back to the start of how we got here, because this is a really important commandment. I see this one, it kind of fills in all of the gaps of the others, where the other 10, they do some really big and important and powerful things, but this is the one that kind of takes all of that stuff and it makes it really hard to find any wiggle room around any of them. So we've got, this kind of fills in all of those gaps. Well, we take our first start at this, which is that we started this series out with a really big and powerful and important idea, which is that the 10 Commandments, let me make sure I get this right. The 10 Commandments were not written for everyone, but that they were written for people that were part of the community of faith. And so over the last 20 years, as we have seen all of these different attempts to try and put the 10 Commandments back in schools and courthouses and public places and all that stuff, they are at best misguided, and at worst, that's a discussion for another time. Because it takes the commandments out of what they're meant for, just puts them up there. So they end up being treated strictly as rules that you either follow or you don't follow, and there's not a whole lot of other stuff in there, and yet they're made for people in a community to help them understand and figure out what it is that's going on. And God didn't give us 10 rules to be followed strictly at all costs. God gave them to us through Moses, knowing full well that it wasn't a matter of if we would break them, but when. If God is all-knowing and all-powerful, he knew this at the start because he knew that we were bad at this even in the garden. We just had one commandment to hold on to, and we couldn't do that one. So he was going to know that we were going to struggle with this as he gave them to us. But they aren't meant to be a strict set of rules. The commandments are given to us as a way of living, to help shape our lives and guide our lives, showing us how to know when we've done wrong so that we can go through the process of confession and forgiveness and reconciliation so that those things can be overcome, so that we can grow and we can become more and better than we were before. He gives them to us to help us to start that process. The law in all of its fullness as we receive it from the Old Testament starts with the 10 Commandments, but it doesn't end there. So much of the rest of that is helping us to understand what those commandments say and then how to overcome them, or how to overcome it when we break them. And we can watch throughout Israel's history, in the times when they do really well, they have followed these commandments great. They have been a part of a community of faith, and they have learned to live by them, and they do really well when they have trouble. It's the times when they have fallen away from all of that. When they are healthy as a community, they can absorb a lot of sin and still be together. In fact, I think that's one of the most important things that the commandments can do, and they can do for us today, is that we've stopped somewhere along the way learning how to, in a healthy way, absorb sin that happens and work through that process of confession and forgiveness and reconciliation so that we can be together as a community of faith. One of the things that we can draw from this, it is so very much needed. And so when we get to the commandment about coveting, it begins to fill in some of those gaps in there. It continues to fill in and help us to understand, how do we live together with one another? How do we be God's people? And how do we work through this process? And that becomes even more important as we get to Jesus' teachings out of Matthew 18, that really is, it's like it's that commandment, only Jesus just paraphrases it a little bit and adds that kind of hard twist to there. Jesus gives us these words, and it really demonstrates for us the challenge that we find in this commandment and we find in his words. Go back to verses 8 and 9. If your hand or your foot causes you to fall into sin, chop it off and throw it away. It's better to enter into life crippled or lame than to be thrown into the eternal fire with 2 hands or 2 feet. If your eye causes you to fall into sin, tear it out and throw it away. It's better to enter into life with 1 eye than to be cast into a burning hell with 2 eyes. Jesus isn't mincing any words in here. And it's okay to be honest here. How many of you, when reading this, begin to get really uncomfortable? Like, I know I do. Like, it's like, I remember when I was starting to learn this as a kid, I'm like, ooh, this is what? I didn't quite know what to make of it when I was younger. But it's the 10th commandment just in different words. Now in the past, there have been lots of different ways of trying to understand what it is that Jesus is saying here. And there's 2 of them, I think, that we can kind of wrap everything up into. And the first is to read these words that Jesus says here, and then to double down on them. To double down on their strength, and to preach them loudly and proudly, that if your eye causes you to sin, then you should tear it out with a rusty spoon. Because that's, if you're going to be loud and proud about preaching this, you've got to add your own piece on there, because Jesus' words aren't hard enough. Let's add another piece into that. And so that was kind of the way that I grew up in there. At least the way I was taught, some in Sunday school, but also the way that then I would see other people preach that and teach that, because I grew up in the televangelist age. So I mean, there was lots of preaching on this all around. And then it gets interpreted, and it's not just your hands and your feet but it's your eyes and what your eyes see, and that makes you think all sorts of things you shouldn't. And so then it moves into your thoughts, and we double down on that you can't even have wrong thoughts because that might cause you to sin, and the whole thing becomes really hard. And there's 2 responses to the doubling down that you can have. One is to take the hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil approach. That says, if I just keep my head down and my mouth shut, then maybe I can avoid any of this stuff. That's hard in every age to do, but much less in the information age with the internet and social media. You know how hard it is to keep your head down and keep your mouth shut? I don't know about you. Sometimes I go to post something on Facebook, I'm like, no, back off, delete. And you know, it's a challenge to do that in this day and age. And it's the one way that we have learned to try and deal with that, but that's not the way that most people do. Because most of us, we hear this, and we hear the impossibility of it. And whenever we hear things that are super impossible like this to follow, we say, well, that's impossible to do, so I'm just not going to worry about it. And so we've taken the commandment, we've taken Jesus' words, and like those are the parts that we like to skip over because they're really hard, and we don't know what to do with them, and we don't get a lot of help, and so we say, oh, we're just going to kind of back off from that and not pay any attention to it. Doubling down is one response to this. That's on one side. On the other side is to say that, well, you know, Jesus was really, he was just engaging in a form of extreme hyperbole. As he was saying these things, he never really meant for us to do all of these things, and so you know, we just say, well, you know, just try really, 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 really hard not to do this in the future. Might be some hand wringing in there about you know, trying really hard, and but we just kind of really water it down, make it really weak. So well, you just try. Jesus didn't really mean all the extremes of this. And so we try to make the commandment in Jesus' words as passable as possible, which ultimately makes them mean nothing. And so we find ourselves in the exact same place. In both ways of trying to take this passage that are the most common, one is either so strict that we can't do any, that we just can't ever do it, and so we say it's impossible and we stop. The other is so weak that we're just like, it's really not all that important, so we just don't give it any credit. So what do we do? Because we still have these passages here in Matthew 18, in other places in Matthew's gospel, like Matthew chapter 5, and then we have the commandment itself out of Exodus and out of Deuteronomy that we have to do. We have to begin to be able to take these seriously, but what do we do with them? On the one hand, I do think that Jesus was engaging in a form of hyperbole to get our attention. And we know, to get our attention, to help us to see what it is that, the danger that we can fall into. Because the sin that we're talking about here, it's the most dangerous one. It's the one that can lead us into all other sorts of sin, and that is coveting. But we have to begin to think through, well, what does that actually entail for us? So let's put all this together. When we come down to it, we've got to know, well, what do we mean by coveting? And here's one of those times when semantics are really important, where we really need to take some time to reflect on and to understand what we're doing. Because to follow the commandments means we have to be active in doing it. Now, this is a different kind of active than in just treating them as rules. And if we're just treating them as rules and we're just looking to check all the boxes and make sure I haven't done all of these things, but we remember the story of the rich young ruler who came up to Jesus and said, well, Lord, I've kept all of the commandments, I've done all those things. And then Jesus says, well, go and sell half of all your possessions and give it to the poor. And he says, whoa, that's a ship too far there, Jesus. I can't handle that one. This is a different kind of active faith. It's one that instead asks us to reflect on the things that we're doing, to ask ourselves why we're doing those things, to ask, is it right? Is it good? To ask ourselves, how do other people see the things that we're doing? Do they see them the same way that we do, or do they see them differently? If they see them differently, how does that work? How do we begin to put these things, these pieces together? Doesn't mean that when I'm doing things wrong if someone sees it differently, or is there a bigger discussion we need to have? And it sounds like a lot of work to do that. And it is. But it's also the kind of work that we normally do. We normally go through our lives asking ourselves these questions. How are we doing? Why are we doing the things that we do? Sometimes we don't think about it, but if we're doing well, we are asking those questions. If we're not, then we're letting other people make those decisions for us. And we all kind of know what happens with that when we let other people try to answer those questions for us. It doesn't always go very well. And so it's better if we do it ourselves. Now, take an example of coveting. Remember, I learned this kind of the hard way a little bit growing up, that, these are very strict sort of understanding of what Jesus is saying here. And then the way that I was taught, because you've got to take it that next step farther, is that any stray thought that you have can cause you to sin, cause you to fall into sin, so you've got to keep control of all of your stray thoughts even. Now, some things haven't changed since I was that tall. I live in my head a lot, so I have lots of thoughts all the time, and I like to people watch. We spent part of yesterday at River Market in Kansas City. Now, it is not quite people of Walmart levels of watching people, but sometimes it can be close. And so there are lots of thoughts that go through your head. Now, I'm also someone that struggles with being able to focus on things. I mean, that's probably not a surprise to anyone. And so, you know what happens when you struggle with focusing on things? You can have 100 thoughts all at one time, except for the one that you really need. And so it becomes kind of a challenge to put all of these pieces together. And so if I were to follow that strict understanding that I learned growing up, I would spend all of my time confessing of thoughts that I might have had, some of which I don't remember, but I'd be really worried about that all the time. The question we have to begin to answer for ourselves is, how many of those thoughts are just stray thoughts or just harmless daydreams, and how many of those are actually coveting? Let's go back to my neighbor with the non-existent donkey. Let's say that non-existent donkey got out and it was over in my yard, and I'd been looking at that donkey saying, I could really use a donkey. I don't know what for. Emily would probably look at me really weird, but say we had that donkey came in, he was in my yard, and I go, well, that donkey's in my yard now, and possession is 9/10 of the law, so, this could be my donkey now, right? Now, in reality, what I would do is I'd take him back over to my neighbor, because it was it was just a fleeting thought, a daydream, not of anything of any importance. I'm like, no, I'm going to go give this donkey back to my neighbor. One, I don't know what you feed a donkey. Imaginary corn? I don't know what goes with that, but that's kind of how that works. Now, on the other hand, if I had taken that donkey and I looked at it and I see my neighbor over there, and I think to myself, there are a bunch of different ways I could get a hold of that donkey. I could, I could go let out the gate. He could get out. Maybe I started having some thoughts about how I could convince or confuse my neighbor about this, and then we're starting to get into territory that is coveting, that could lead me into doing things that aren't right, that aren't good, that could cause harm to myself, could cause harm to my neighbor, could cause harm to everyone that gets involved in that. That's all of a sudden, now we have gone into a place where this is where we are actually sinning, where we are beginning to covet, where it's no longer just a fleeting thought or a daydream, but now we've entered into a place where real problems can come. This is why following the commandments has to be active work. Because we have to know, is this something that actually could be covetous? Could be leading us into a place that we don't need to go, that if we follow this out, we could find ourselves in some trouble, or is it just a flight of fancy? Take as another example, has anyone ever daydreamed about winning the lottery? I mean, and I'm not talking just like scratch-off tickets where you win a couple of bucks and then cause everyone in Casey's to stand there for another 10 minutes while you get more tickets and scratch them off. I'm talking about the billion-dollar Mega Millions jackpot, and you're thinking, ooh, that could be fun. I like to give my dad a hard time because he got bored at work on a regular basis a few years before he retired, and so he had a fancy spreadsheet filled out for, he could put in what it was and would tell, oh, here's all the fun things I'm going to do with this, because he was bored. But dreaming about that, daydreaming about when you do that, that's not a problem. Now, when I was a kid, I was told that was kind of a problem, but it's really not a big deal. Now, if we go into the process of starting to spend lots of money on tickets, maybe harmful amounts of money, or maybe we do other things that start to, cause family problems and that sort of thing. Now we've entered into a bad place, or maybe we just look at it and say, my odds of winning a Powerball are really small. It'd just be easier if I go rob a bank instead. Then we have definitely got into the problem areas. But it's hard. This is hard work to do. Because we have to know ourselves, we have to know our motives. And we have to be able to reflect on that honestly with ourselves and know what we're doing and why we're doing it. But it gets easier though, because we remember how the commandments were given to us. They aren't given to us just as 10 rules to follow, and you either follow them or you don't, but they're given to us as a part of a community. A community that it's part of that job is to help us to understand those commandments, to help us understand how they come together, to help us understand what it means to follow them. It's why in Jewish tradition they had what they called the Midrash, which was basically the entire community coming together and reflecting on how all the laws impacted their lives and what they do, and how then you work out when you do break them, how you are reconciled to the community, how you show your confession, and how you show forgiveness, and how you are reconciled back to build that healthy community. This is what we receive in following the commandments. That we aren't on this all on our own. That we are given, they're given to us as a part of a community that can help us to understand them. And they help us to follow them, and help us to recover when we break them. And even though it's active and it feels hard to do that, it's better than the alternative because we're sharing it with one another. And we know that we have a loving God that didn't set us up to fail. He didn't give us these commandments saying, well, if you fail, so that we could know if we failed in keeping them, but gave them to us and said, I know you are going to fail. We're just going to start there and know that that is going to be a thing. But here's how you can begin to learn and to overcome them also. He gave us the commandments so we could learn and grow and become more and overcome the things that happen. And as Christian people, we know this in a very real way because Christ has come to show us that in a way that hadn't ever happened before. And so we go out today knowing that we are going to covet, whether it's our hands or feet or eyes or thoughts or whatever it is, that we are going to covet. It's going to happen. But we also know that God has given us what we need so that we can figure that out, understand it, so that we can ask for forgiveness, and we can receive it, and we can find reconciliation, and we can know that He sent His Son into the world so that all of those things can be overcome. And so let us go and be people of the commandments, not of rules, but of the way of life that God gives to us so that we can become more than we are now. Let us go and let us be these people in the name of the one that God sent into this world to make that possible. Let us do this in Christ's name. Amen.